If I began that process at all in his presence, it was not in the classroom, but in the hours we spent studying work together in the small space of his office. Everybody's impressed by the small space of his office, I think. Our most sustained and serious study was of Plato's Phaedo, which we read together for a semester and then continued through letters the following year when I was in Germany trying to write it up. We had some strong disagreements. I fought hard sometimes. I think he liked that. But often I discovered that the disagreement was really because I hadn't understood him, and when I did, it was usually compelling. Perhaps I should have worried more about being independent enough. I think I know why I did not. Working with him was such an intense experience of trying to get at the point of the work and think through the issues it raises. There was never a sense of subordination to his authority, only to what we were trying to get at in common. This, too, I think, belongs to that separation from the self that Benardete understood by the practice of dying and being dead. At some point during my years at the New School, a small group of us persuaded Benardete to start going out regularly after class. We would flood him with a barrage of questions about the session as we drifted out and made our way to the Cedar Tavern, later replaced by Homer's Diner, where no one bothered us for hours, almost any time of day or night. The conversations that started out with questions about the work we were studying ranged from there over politics and history, Judaism and Christianity, Hegel and Heidegger, back to Plato again. This is when I learned what a wonderful storyteller Benardete was. Out of the most particular observations about people, he could open up the most fundamental questions. He was always reading something fascinating. The memoir of a Christian missionary to the Aztecs, 2 women traveling through the Gobi Desert, the Kabbalah. Conversations often spilled over into the streets. He liked to think while walking. He would proceed a block or two, maybe less, then abruptly stop and concentrate for a moment, everyone else stopping with him. The rhythm of walking, an outward manifestation of his thinking. I don't think there was ever a conversation, I know it sounds unbelievable, that didn't combine a sense of being engaged in an activity of the utmost seriousness while having so much fun. After I left New York, our ongoing dialogue was carried on largely through letters, later email, mostly through the disembodied medium of the telephone. Early Sunday morning was Robert's time. He would pick up the phone and hear Benadete's voice. "I thought you would want to know," and get absorbed for hours. Benardete would call at all kinds of odd hours, eager to share his excitement about his discoveries. And he was always making discoveries, because philosophy, in his eyes, as he once put it, I think just perfectly, is the concrete encounter with the unexpected. He exemplified this uniquely in his own thinking and reading, his conversation and writing. No predetermined system or method stood in the way of such an encounter, and yet he certainly had his tools of thinking and was pursuing a vision of the whole, developing over a lifetime his central themes: Eros and the beautiful, the city and the law in its role of making human beings human, the poets and their gods. His mind did seem to move in leaps, which was exhilarating to some and provoked others. But if one had the privilege to talk and slow him down for a moment, or if one did the work oneself, one could see the complex path of very careful steps that led him to his conclusion. And those paths grew in complexity as he returned to the same works over 40 years, starting all over again without exactly abandoning the prior layers. He so often formulated his ideas in paradoxes, not, I think, to be obscure or provocative, but to capture what he found to be the paradoxical character of things, at least as seen through philosophic eyes. What death means is the philosopher's lifelong practice of dying. That does not make it any less simply the sorrowful end of life, which slaps us in the face with another paradox: non-being is. Benardete liked the image of thinking as a process of walking in sand, leaving footprints only for a moment, to be covered over again as one proceeds on a trackless way forward. He was always more excited about the unknown way ahead than about leaving monuments behind. But in his absence, I think many of us are very grateful for whatever traces of his footsteps are preserved through his writings, the memories we have and share, our own efforts to carry on.
José Benardete, Professor of Philosophy, Syracuse University.
Well, as you can imagine, it's really something learning so much about Seth. Even among speaking here, I'm sure that comparing one's own with what others have been saying, there are certain slippages here, isn't it, at times? Mistakes, I think, are always sort of just adding up to one harmonious picture with different takes. And I thought that in my own case, the inevitable interest we might have would be not in the part of my life which, after all, spends over these years that you shared, the part of Seth's life. The early part. What was so and in fact, listening to you talk, for me, the question was, what happened? Because I knew we were fine. I always been 2 years older. Of course, I never let Seth forget that. So, what was Seth like? So I had to think about that. Not just in itself what it was like, but how does that relate to what I've been just hearing? Actually, of course, what I have been hearing, of course, fits in very nicely with the stuff I've known over how many decades then. But what about that early part? Well, Seth came from a very fortunate family. I mean, that's the truth. Particularly our father, the subject himself, the real pirate. And tyrant. It wasn't easy to get into. I had to fight very, very hard. My mother also, because we were both aggressively brutal. So perhaps the most important thing to say about Seth's early life, Seth really had no chance to say it. I mean, really. I mean, I really had to fight with my father. Dinner table. And in fact, my mother would be kicking me under the table, you know, telling me to shut up. By the end of the evening, he'd be smacking me. You know. So, you know, and Seth would be there, quiet. I mean, that's, you know, so if you want to think of that, you know, this was, I mean, in retrospect, you can say he was storing all this up. You know, that eloquence then comes much, much later. But he always remains, after all. I think you all perhaps see this in Seth. There was a quietness about Seth, basically. You know, there were those years, right? In fact, it was quite astonishing when I went off to college, and when I came back, there was a transformed Seth. Maybe he was 14, 15, 16. You know. I mean, so in looking back, there's an important gap here that I'm really not in a position to fill. Something happened. You know, there was really a quantum jump. Of course, what helped was, you know, we look at it this way, my mother and father were divorced, you know, so my father was off, you know, and that sort of left space, you know, you know, and then I was off to college, you know, and then something happened, and must also realize that the rest of us were all very verbal, interested in literary things. Well, we always thought of Seth as being interested with his hands. He was always there, you know, and he was going to become an engineer. That was the picture. Nothing to do with words. Words, no. I mean, he was not only quiet, but that was his thing, you know. He was very skillful with his hands. That was the thing he liked to do. And he went on to Brooklyn Technical High School. My mother had a fancy version of this. You know, she wanted to, you know, a more artistic side of it. So, you know, Seth would become an architect. And I can't help thinking that maybe some of Seth's talents, right, when you think that he realized, those of you who think, you know, he was a fully realized person, there's a whole side of his life that was not realized in anything that came out here. And in a methodological way, I tend to think that in his children, his son Ethan, a fastidious brain surgeon, did that leap over? Does that come from him? And his daughter, Ethan, who's been studying architecture at N.Y.U. The artistic side, mother would have been so pleased. So actually, there's a whole part of Seth's life, though speaking of this great self-fulfillment, there was a side of Seth's life that was not fulfilled in his professional activity, which perhaps is being realized in his children. When I came back, the immediate sign of the change in Seth was he was writing stories in a kind of super Henry James style. I mean, he'd never done anything literary. And perhaps if one is really trying to fill this, find the missing link here, the only one I know of who could possibly fill that one was Hillel Gilder. They were students together at Brooklyn Technical High School and became close friends. And Hillel Gilden went later on to Chicago to study with the Committee on Social Thought. So the one who was really on the spot here was Hillel. So I have to then say, you know, I can give you some sense of what happened, and just simply say there's a gap here that needs to be filled, and the one to fill it would be Hillel Gilden.